This is Johnny and the Professor. Common sense in senseless time.
Earlier today, the group Project Veritas released a series of audio and video recordings it says were made by someone within CNN. Here's Jeff Zucker telling his employees that no matter what else is going on in the world, the impeachment of Donald Trump is nevertheless the only story that really matters.
We're moving towards impeachment. I mean, don't, we shouldn't pretend, this is going one way, and so all these moves are moves towards impeachment. So don't lose sight of what the big story is.
Listen as a CNN staffer explains that he and the rest of them know exactly what Jeff Zucker wants.
The impeachment stuff, there's new developments every day, more shoes dropping. There's just nothing we can do. If Zucker wants impeachment every single day to be the top story. That's what he wants. Yeah, he wants impeachment. So above all else, honestly. Above all else.
There's a lot of people who are out here trying to just do what they think is the best of journalistic integrity. And then you get on the 9 a.m. call, and big boss Jeff Zucker tells you what to do. And it's you have to, to a certain extent, you have to follow his verdict.
Johnny and the Professor. Common sense in senseless times.
I think it was disgraceful that the intelligence agencies allowed any information that turned out to be so false and fake. And that's something that Nazi Germany would have done and did do. I think it's a disgrace that information that was false and fake and never happened got released to the public. And as far as CNN going out of their way to build it up, it's a disgrace what took place. I'm not going to give you a question. You are fake news. Everybody back there, the fake news media.
CNN President Jeff Zucker actually ordered his reporters to get off real news and back to Russia because, hey, it's a cash cow.
This is Johnny and the Professor.
It's Johnny and the Professor. It's Johnny and the Professor.
Common sense for senseless times.
Where we talk politics, pop culture, and prey, as in Birds of Prey, the new Harley Quinn movie we'll be talking about here in a bit. Anyway, now last week we aired a rerun of today's guest. Thought it'd be interesting to hear the contrasts as the political climate is constantly evolving. And, dear Professor, you want to introduce our guest?
Yeah, our guest today is Victor Davis Hanson, and he's a fellow from the Hoover Institute and a classicist and a noted historian and one of my former professors. It's good to have you on the show today, Professor Hanson.
Thank you for having me.
I thought we might talk about last week in politics. I mean, it literally was, I heard somebody put it up as Mr. Trump's wild ride from the Iowa caucuses to the State of the Union. And I wonder what you think about the Iowa caucuses, how that it ended up coming out much different than most people anticipated.
There's a lot of irony and paradox there because the caucuses are sort of an archaic 19th century phenomenon, and they were supposedly going to be updated by progressive tech wizards and with new apps, and it was going to bring it into the 21st century. And of course, that didn't happen. It boomeranged. So not only did it convey the impression that the Democratic Party was not the party of hip young techies, but of incompetence, but more importantly, it was the first trial run for this primary season, so it became iconic that things were going wrong already. Something radically is wrong with the polls because the public was watching Joe Biden anywhere from 25 to 35% of the national polls, and yet when anecdotally there were interviews on TV with voters or the Iowa caucus or now the New Hampshire primary, those polls were not borne out by concrete support, at least in these first two venues. The Democratic Party didn't get off to a process that was encouraging, and then as far as the actual results, such as we know them, of these two primaries now, not that these constituencies are representative of the electorate in general, but nonetheless, when you have Buttigieg and Sanders, you're way to the left of what usually has been successful for Democratic candidates. The only person who ran with an agenda this far left was Barack Obama in 2008, and he was successful largely because of his iconic status as the first African American. He was much more mellifluous and charismatic than current field. There was the 2008 meltdown. John McCain ran an anemic campaign. So I think they're not off to a good start.
Curious about what you think about as far as Bernie Sanders. I mean, again, Bernie Sanders is not even a Democrat. He isn't registered as a Democrat. And yet he is, as far as I can tell, Bernie Sanders is a communist.
Well, he's the first serious socialist, I guess, we've had since Eugene Debs in 1920, or maybe Huey Long in the late 30s. So that brand of redistribution by government has not been really popular in America. That's why people came to the United States, to get away from European ossified class systems and intrusive government. And so I don't think that any of the issues that he's embraced, or even any of the Democrats have embraced, reparations, the New Green Deal, Medicare for all, wealth tax, banning of fracking or horizontal drilling, the abolishment of the Electoral College, of ICE, canceling of all student debt. None of those are registered, maybe with the exception of student debt. 51% majority approval. So it's hard to see how those candidates are going to pivot, since they're so solidly on record for a series of positions that have no majority support among voters.
I always think it's strange that we get the polling data and that it goes a particular direction. Of course, a classic example of this would have been the 2016 election. And yet the people going there, is it the pollers you think the fault in this, or are the people just not reporting accurate anymore? When they do they not actually answer polls truthfully anymore, I wonder?
I think what we're watching in the Democratic Party is that there's a fear that about 20% of the general electorate is hard left, and that's brought about by the decline in middle-class wages until 2017, the big student debt, increased prices of homes. And so for 20% of the country, especially youth that are educated in areas that are not necessarily competitive when they graduate, and they have all the student debt, they look at the world and they say, I can't get married and have kids right away, I can't buy a home, I can't pay off my debt, socialism is the answer. But that's a very small percentage of the American electorate. But in this particular primary, I don't even think they're the majority of the Democratic Party by any means, but in the primaries, they can allow a candidate that gets overwhelming support with this AOC squad constituency, maybe 25 or 27% of the electorate in the primary. And so that's what Bernie Sanders has done. And if you notice, Biden and Klobuchar and Buttigieg in his latest incarnation have split that moderate vote. And the more Warren fades, the more Sanders has a monopoly on what is a minority position, but he's got a monopoly on it. And in aggregate numbers, it's equal to or greater than splitting up the traditional Democratic vote among three candidates. So either the three candidates, two are going to have to drop out and they're all going to have to endorse one, or Sanders is going to get the nomination.
Do you think there's a possibility? It occurred to me that you might get an alliance, too. If you had, say, Klobuchar and Buttigieg, who I was surprised Klobuchar actually did fairly well in New Hampshire. I mean, she came in third as far as last data. That's still being counted, too, as far as I know.
Is a lot more left-wing than he has sounded in the last month. He really doesn't have an ideology. He's just glib. So what he does is he surveys the spectra of candidates and positions, and then when he sees changes in public support, he focuses on that. And now it's in his interest to, as Biden starts to fade, that he's going to pick up Biden's support a little bit to the right of the center. So now he's sounding a lot different, but he really isn't different than he was. And he's always been a hardcore leftist. But I think you're going to see some kind of coalitions. That reminds me of Ted Cruz. I think he figured out that Rubio, Cruz, Kasich, that one of them had to drop out early and give the support to the other, because Trump was winning the polls and the primaries with about a 35% level of support, and the rest of them had more than that, but not individually, and yet they didn't collaborate. And finally, Cruz was forced. I think he named Carla Fiorina as his vice president candidate in hopes of getting female votes, but none of that worked, and they just couldn't believe that Trump was going to win the primaries or get the nomination, so each one held out to the end, even though in aggregate they might have been able to stop Trump. And Bernie's counting on the same strategy, that no one thinks he's going to win. And so Biden or Klobuchar or Buttigieg are all going to stay until the very end, thinking on Bloomberg that I'll win, and then these other candidates will give them their endorsements. And that's what Sanders is hoping happens, that they just keep splitting that vote, and then he can consolidate the left-wing vote. Warren, I think, there's a lot of problems that she has. She can't tell the truth. She's contradictory. Her manner on the stump is shrill and off-putting. When you're in a neighboring state and you can't win you can't even beat a socialist, and you're a left-wing Massachusetts senator. It's not very encouraging.
So what did you think also last week of the State of the Union address?
Well, he's doing pretty well for a mayor. I live in the San Joaquin Valley, and there's a lot of towns like Visalia, Merced, Modesto that have more residents than South Indiana. And the idea that the mayor of Clovis or the mayor of Visalia would be a serious contender for a presidential nomination is absurd. And he didn't have all that successful a record. He's a reflection of the poverty of the field in general, and then he has this Obama ability of being on the stump pretty articulate. But he doesn't, I think the more attention that's given to him, he's got two real problems. One is he never really answers a question. He just goes off on these tangents that sound great, and then when he's done, you think, wow, that guy is really well-spoken, but what did he say? And people are starting to pick up on that. And the second is that there's the elephant in the room that nobody wants to talk about, and that is in the Democratic primary, the 10 to 12% African American vote in the general election is magnified, and it grows to about 35% of all Democratic voters in the primary, maybe even 40% in some places. And so if you're a Democratic candidate, you have to appeal to that constituency. And he doesn't. And I mean he doesn't in a way that exceeds the negativity of Warren or Sanders or others. And the question is, why is that? Why are black folks? Is it because they're turned off by him because of his record as a mayor? No. Nobody really knows what he did in South Bend. So I think the answer is that there's a resistance in the African American community to overt homosexuality, especially of the type that he displays when he gets on the stump and hugs or kisses his husband. And the Democrats have not wanted to discuss this because it goes against their sense of intersectionality, that gays and transgender people and blacks and Chicanos and feminists, that each one of their oppressions is when they join together creates a loud voice of dissent that's a majority, but it's not so harmonious. And we saw that in California here a few years ago when on two occasions, the electorate voted to ban gay marriage, and the left got very angry and blamed our small Mormon population. And then when they found out that blacks, by an overwhelmingly large number, had voted against gay marriage, both of them were thrown out by the Ninth Circuit, so it was nullified anyway. But they were very angry. They didn't quite know how to articulate that anger because it was directed at African Americans, at least privately. And I don't know how that's going to play out, but at some point it's going to become an issue. We'll have to wait for the South Carolina primary. As soon as that primary comes, if the anemic Biden candidacy is resuscitated, then people are going to just start talking about it, and we'll see what happens.
Now, I hear rumor that Bloomberg is going to ask Hillary Clinton to be his vice president. Do you see any validity in that, or is that just, dumb people saying dumb things?
Well, you can see the logic of it because he's got all the money and she's got the name recognition, and they're going right up to Trump, the middle of the spectrum, and they're saying to Trump, everything to our left will have no choice but us, and we're the competent people, and if you want a billionaire, why get a billionaire with $2 billion when you get a guy with $60 billion?
Right.
And I'm more successful, and et cetera, et cetera. But the danger in that is that Hillary Clinton is a toxic personality, and people don't like her. And second, as we saw this week, Bloomberg's got a long voice and paper trail, and it's pretty bad if you're a leftist. The things he said about blacks and crime, etc., and women, sexual harassment. And so the effect of that is it nullifies the big talking points against Trump. Trump is a supposed racist. Trump is a supposed sexist. And then you put a guy on the ticket, and Trump is a billionaire that doesn't care about people. And that was always a problem with the Bloomberg candidacy. You're going to have to tell the Democratic voter that, well, Trump is a greater racist than our candidate Bloomberg, and he's a greater sexist than our candidate Bloomberg, and he's a billionaire, but not quite as successful as our billionaire Bloomberg. And then when you add Hillary in the mix, she's like Biden. Biden has failed twice, and she's failed twice. And people who fail twice in America, we love people who make comebacks, but not after failing twice. Then you become sort of like an also-ran that just won't quit. I think she and Biden are pretty much had it.
Yeah, well, at least they're not running together. That would be, though I have to admit, a debate on the stage with Bloomberg and Bernie Sanders, the multi-billionaire versus the, I want to take. There's no such thing as a legitimate billionaire. I mean, that would be funny amusing to listen to.
Yeah, I think the Democrats have some problems. They have a lot of problems, but one of them is that the rhetoric that they beat everybody with, like a club, is now reverberating. Like we've been told that they believe, or we all should believe, in disproportionate or proportionate representation, and then there's disparate impact. And that doctrine says that for important, prestigious jobs, people shall represent the racial makeup of the United States. Of course, we don't quite enforce it for, NFL players and NBA players, but that was what the Democrats told us. And so here, the party of people of color eliminated on the basis of their formula that you had to have a certain successful level of fundraising and a certain polling number. They eliminated Kamala Harris and Cory Booker and basically Deval Patrick and Castro and Beto. I don't know what Beto is. He's Hispanic. But then you have this all-white field, and how does Bloomberg get in? Well, the only reason he's in there, and why was Steyer on the stage? Does anybody believe Tom Steyer would be on that stage without spending over $100 million? Does anybody believe that Bloomberg would ever be on that debate stage that's coming up in 2 weeks if he didn't spend all this money? And the money is, of course, translates into polling as well. So they've got kind of a rigged system that's antithetical to their very founding principles. And I don't know how they're going to square that circle. People will notice, but it makes it kind of ridiculous. You've got on one hand Sanders railing about the concentration of wealth, and then you've got the alternatives to Sanders, the epitome of a concentration of wealth in Bloomberg. And then you've got Warren railing about sexual disparities, and you've got Bloomberg with a lot of history of sexual harassment accusations. So the net effect of all this, to make it simple, is that it's going to nullify a lot of the traditional criticisms against Trump.
So in the long run, their candidacy ends up helping Trump. In the hollowed halls of Congress, though, last week we also had, of course, the State of the Union address and the acquittal of President Trump. So I thought...
I think
Go ahead.
That was a bad week. Getting back to your original question, they had a terrible week with the Iowa caucuses on Monday, and then on Tuesday, the State of the Union didn't go well because it wasn't that partisan. It was partisan in bragging on his achievements, but they had all these inspirational stories that Trump interspliced with his speech, deliberately so. But once they got in this mood, either they weren't going to show up, or they were going to boo, or they were going to walk out. They didn't know the effect of that on these inspirational stories. So Trump would say, "Stand up," and then this very moving story, and you look and they cut over to their faces, and he had staged it in such a way that they were not always disproving of him, but their animus was such that it disproved of these very nice people, and he knew that, and it really made them look ridiculous. And then Nancy Pelosi tearing up the speech was a public relations disaster. And then when you went to the acquittal on Wednesday, then people said to themselves, well, we knew this was going to happen, and why did we waste all this time impeaching him when we had this acquittal? And they only got one Republican senator, and it was a complete waste of time. And then when you went Friday with the debate, and they showed these ridiculous positions that these candidates were embracing, and they really basically wanted to give away free stuff, and they hate Donald Trump. That's all they articulated. So I guess what I'm saying is, you add up the Iowa caucuses, the State of the Union, the acquittal, and the Democratic alternative on television on a Friday night of all things at prime time, and nobody watched it. It's pretty bad. You can even throw the Oscars in there at the beginning of this week. And it's not a picture that appeals to 51% of Americans.
And in the course of Trump, of course, being impeached, the Gallup poll put him from 39 to 49% approval, and he's 94% amongst Republicans. So, I mean, they seem to be doing a good job at getting Donald Trump reelected as president.
Yeah, he's gone up, depending on which poll you lose or the aggregate Real Clear Politics average, he's gone up about 8 points since September when this whole whistleblower thing started on Ukraine. And so if you think about it, it's been a great gift for Trump, because he's climbed up in the polls, and the Republican brand that was 6 or 7 points below the Democratic brand generically is now slightly more positive than Democrats are. And putting out there every day for 90 days Gerald Nadler and Adam Schiff and Nancy Pelosi was not a winning message. And it kind of sucked out all the air from the Democratic candidates, 3 of whom were senators, when Cory Booker himself was for. There was Sanders and Warren and Klobuchar, and then also Booker at the time. So it kind of took away their candidacies, and it just sort of, people said obstruction of Congress is basically what presidents do. They always don't want to give everything. Obama didn't do it, so much so that they held Eric Holder in contempt. And then abuse of power, that's not even in the Constitution as an actionable writ of impeachment, and that's sort of what presidents were always accused of, abusing their power. It's sort of like Obama on 21 occasions saying that he couldn't give amnesty because he'd have to be a king and violate the law, and then he just suddenly did it in 2012 election cycle. It was a disaster for the Democrats. Unless there's a recession, or there's some type of war in the Middle East, which I doubt, or there's another impeachment 3.0 that works, I don't see any of the traditional things that deny an incumbent president re-election. They usually get re-elected unless there's a non-popular war, or there's an economic disaster, or there's a scandal. But I don't see that in the horizon for Trump.
Hey, we got to take a quick break. More with Victor Davis Hanson coming up on Johnny and the Professor.
This is Johnny and the Professor. Common sense in senseless times.
You testified before this committee that Google's manipulation of votes gave at least 2.6 million additional votes to Hillary Clinton in the year 2016. Is that correct?
That's correct. And the methods that they're using are invisible. They're subliminal. They're more powerful than most any effects I've ever seen in the behavioral sciences, and I've been in the behavioral sciences for almost 40 years. The 2.6 million is a rock bottom minimum.
Contact the show at jpshowfm@gmail.com. This is Johnny and the Professor. Common sense in senseless times.
The point here is that when people focus on income inequality, I think that this is actually a rather large moral mistake. Focusing on poverty is a good thing to do. Focusing on income inequality is not a good thing to do, because there's no correlation between income inequality and relative rates of poverty. Right? There's tremendous income inequality in a lot of places on planet Earth. If you go to Sudan, there's going to be a rich warlord there, and then there are going to be a bunch of people living on $6 a year. Okay? That's a terrible place to live. Income inequality in the United States is also quite high. Right? There are people who are Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos, and then there's the local checker at your grocery store. But if the local checker at your grocery store is getting richer, then it seems to me they have nothing particularly to complain about in how the economy is operating.
Contact the show at jpshowfm@gmail.com.
Johnny and the Professor, where we talk politics, pop culture, and pray. Our guest returning, Victor Davis Hanson, he was on the show a few months back, and he returns to update us on his insights into the political spectrum, the political environment.
I thought the total insult to injury on federal judge also threw out the Democrats' case about Trump violating the Emoluments Clause. The job market came out, and it was 225,000 new jobs, and unemployment's now to 3.6. I mean, it's just so...
I just don't think that... I think the American public are looking at the jobs report, the unemployment, peacetime record unemployment rate, record minority unemployment lows, and they ask themselves, or they look around and they say, there's pretty low inflation, there's pretty low interest rates, there's pretty good growth, there's low unemployment. We got a problem with the debt, but that's... I guess we're not going to reckon with that until we have to. But you can see it. I think most Americans can see it. I travel a lot, and you can just see when you go to a restaurant, it's more crowded than it was 5 years ago. If you get on the road, traffic's more crowded. If you go to a service station, there's more people filling up. If you want to go buy something, it's a little bit harder to do. There's greater crowds. So everybody senses that the economy is... Anybody who wants to work can get a job. And at the same time this is happening, people are saying, gosh, they sued about the electors way back when Trump was elected, tried to subvert it. There was a voting machine, there was the Emoluments Clause, there was a Logan Act, there was a 25th Amendment, there was all that celebrity stuff about blowing him up, decapitating him, burning him up, stabbing him, beating his face up. And then there was Mueller for 22 months, and then we had Stormy and Michael Cohen and Michael Avenatti, and then we had Ukraine, and then the recession, and I think they just got sick of it, and they said, we have an election coming up. Let's just have the election.
Right.
But, of course, the fear in that is that from the Democrats is very simple, that he will be reelected. And that, of course, and the worst scenario is...
and they said that. It wasn't just Representative Green that said if we don't do this, he's going to get elected. Nancy Pelosi said that earlier. And some others have said that. Donald Trump was going to get elected unless they could stop him. Maxine Waters said that as well, basically. So they know that. And they're because they know from 2016 that these polls are fraudulent. I mean, when you look at the Reuters poll and it has Trump down 14 points, and a Harris poll or Gallup poll has him down 1, then or Political has him down 13 points. You know that those are young pollsters or young operatives that are trying to massage that result to create a sense that Trump's in trouble. But it's not an accurate poll, and it wasn't in 2016. So I think the Democrats are terrified that even when they get 1 or 2 points or 3-point polls saying that Bernie's more popular than Trump, it really is, he's down 3, because either the pollsters are not being honest and the vast majority of them are left-wing, or people, even do an anonymous phone call or text, think, I don't want to give any data about me that suggests I'm a Trump supporter because somebody will mine this, or my name will be on some list, or I'll be harassed, so I'm just not going to answer truthfully. And there's 3 or 4% that might feel that way, that are polled. And so that I'm not suggesting that all the polls are fraudulent, but there's enough of them that are suspect that bring down his averages of all aggregate polls enough to give a false impression of weakness.
I've recently seen you on Fox News, on Laura Ingraham. You seem to be a fairly stable of her guest on her show. I was wondering, are you? You said you've been doing a lot of traveling around. Do you have any other projects that you're working on that you might want to mention and talk about?
Oh, you mean a new book?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm working on a book called The Dying Citizen, and it's about the attack on American citizenship from both the pre-modern and postmodern angles. And by that I mean the conflation of citizenship with residency. In the case of just illegal aliens, we have 20 million probably here that are. There's a whole move to make a green card holder or an illegal resident to get the same rights as far as entitlement, voting, etc., citizenship, to water down citizenship. We're also diminishing it with the ossification of the middle class, the idea that young people can get married, have children, buy a home, and find wages to support a family is in question. Trump's trying to address that, but it's been in question for 20 or 30 years. And then from the postmodern, that we have a whole elite group of people who believe we're citizens of the world, that the UN Criminal Court, or UN Commission on Human Rights, or the EU, these are areas in jurisprudence and politics that should have the equal voice of the American Constitution. And then finally, we have a systematic elite assault on the Constitution. We have efforts to water down the Second Amendment to judicial opinions. The First Amendment really doesn't exist anymore on college campuses. We have every one of the major Democratic candidates is on record that they want to abolish the Electoral College, and half of them want to change the makeup of the Supreme Court. So I'm interested in the idea that being a U.S. citizen doesn't mean that much either here or abroad anymore in a way that it used to.
When do you think this is going to be published?
But I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
I'm sorry. When do you think this book is to be published?
Yeah, well, I had a 4-book contract, which is a lot at my age. I'm 66, with basic books, and I finished the Second World Wars 3 years ago, a history of World War II, and then the book on Trump last year. And I think I have to turn this manuscript in on November 1st. So it should come out basically a year from now.
Well, I definitely would like to read it. I've read several of your books, and I've found them very enlightening.
Well, thank you. I'm looking forward to it. It's kind of a depressing book, but I'm trying to make it a little bit upbeat. In some ways, Trump has addressed a lot of that by closing the border, 80% reduction in illegal immigration, and denying amnesties, de facto amnesties, and real wages for the middle class have gone up 3% in the last 3 years. But the labor participation rate is still anemic, and home buying is still problematic. And I don't know, anybody doesn't quite know what to do about this $1.5 trillion in student debt. And the age when people are marrying, the age when people are having children has gone way, way up to about 30 years old in some places. So something to worry about.
It is, and I've never understood the whole citizen of the world nonsense anyway. Do you sure you want to be, if you're going to be a citizen of the world, don't you need to move it down to the most common denominator? And do people in America want to be living with the rights of that at that level?
Citizens of the world is an ancient concept.
Agreed.
Plato doesn't say Socrates said it. I think Plutarch said he said it.
Yeah.
But it's this philosophical ideal that we're all human and we shouldn't let borders or boundaries disrupt this common humanity. That's just fine, but the problem with it is in the modern context, citizen of the world is a synonym for anti-American.
True.
Because we are so dominant culturally and politically, socially, economically, militarily. And when a person says, I am a citizen of the world, they're usually American, and they're usually critiquing their own country, or they're, to be frank, when I Google that and I do a systematic search of that term, it's usually used in the context of most of the world doesn't have the Second Amendment, or most of the world allows abortion on demand, or most of the world has a green initiative or the Paris Climate Accord participation, or something like that. So it's more of a left-wing utopian idea that we have to move beyond a parochial America.
whether it works or not, whether they could actually live in that world or not.
Yeah, it's become a circumlocution or a euphemism, a way of expressing dislike of the United States by saying that you've transcended the United States. Believe it or not, Obama said it on 3 public occasions that I come to you as a citizen of the world, he said. And he said that in Germany. He said it on his apology tour. He said it in the United States. So it got a lot of traction under him.
Well, Professor, I know we've probably hit the end of the time you have for us, so we should probably be letting you go. A pleasure, as always. Fascinating. And
well, thank you for having me.
And I will definitely do this again. Thank you, sir.
It's Johnny and the Professor, where we talk politics, pop culture, and prey, like Birds of Prey. Here's our friend the Critical Drinker and his take on Birds of Prey.
Oh, Warner Brothers, what are you doing to us? In your time, you've given us some of the best comic book movies ever, but then you tried to jump on the Marvel Extended Universe bandwagon, except without all the planning and patience and quality control, and you ended up delivering absolute shit. Remember Suicide Squad, everyone? Remember thinking, wow, this Harley Quinn is awesome. I really hope she gets to star in her own goofy, cartoonish, R-rated female empowerment movie alongside a bunch of characters nobody ever heard of? Nah, me neither. Birds of Prey and the Fantabulous off film. Stop trying to be funny and quirky. Birds of Prey is a garbage movie, and I mean that in the most literal sense of the word. It's disposable entertainment of the highest order, something you're expected to consume with absolutely zero thought or intelligence and then promptly forget about, just like the people who made it. A vanity project spun off from a failed superhero team-up that nobody cared about. A vapid, self-indulgent, meaningless, badly written, horribly paced conglomeration of different ideas that work together about as effectively as Kathleen Kennedy and directors who are capable of independent thought. Pitched to a market that doesn't exist and starring a bunch of actors who aren't big or interesting enough to get arses in seats. In short, it was a complete chore to get through. Birds of Prey is already flopping hard at the box office, and when I stopped to ponder why, I find myself coming back to the same question I asked of Charlie's Angels. Who was this movie even made for? It's not for men, that's for sure. The marketing made it clear this is a movie about female empowerment, misogyny and everyday sexism, which doesn't exactly scream light-hearted fun for most guys. The R rating means that most families won't go to see it, and even women don't seem to care about it. Probably because they now have a pretty good sense of when they're being pandered to, and they're not as dumb as Hollywood seems to think. You can't just slap the term female empowerment on a crappy film and expect them to flock to it. Ultimately, Birds of Prey feels like a rushed, poorly conceived vanity project, spawned from a mediocre superhero film and based around an actress with an overinflated sense of her own star power. Robbie is a perfectly good actress, and let's be honest, she's not exactly hard on the eye either, but she's more of a rising star than a real box office draw, and I think that, just like her character, this movie was an attempt to prove she could stop leaning on her male co-stars and strike out on her own. Unfortunately, its failure to connect with audiences kind of demonstrates the opposites. Better luck next time, Harley. Anyway, that's all I've got for today. Go away now.
Have you seen Birds of Prey?
I've been watching some of the excerpts from it, and I've read the comic books that it was based off of, but no, I haven't seen the series as of yet, but I have been looking at some of the reviews and information on it. Yeah,
they're not too good reviews.
No.
So bad that they've actually changed the title of the movie after it was released. It was Birds of Prey and the Fantabulous Emancipation of One Harley Quinn. Now it's just Harley Quinn, Birds of Prey.
So they assume that Harley Quinn, because of for what? From the Suicide Squad is popular enough that people are going to know who that is?
I guess.
Originally, the Batman animated series, it was where they introduced the character Harley Quinn. It was in an episode called Joker's Favor, and she was his little hench wench. There was a term they even used in the episode, and you didn't know who she was in that story, but she was this woman dressed in a Harley Quinn outfit and had this kind of Brooklyn accent, and then they used her in several episodes. They expanded on that, and then because of that popularity, they actually did stuff in comic books with her. And then from comic books, they went into the movies with the Suicide Squad.
Okay.
She was Harleen Quinzel, is a psychiatrist who worked at Arkham Institution, when the Joker was incarcerated there and his many times there. And she actually fell in love with him because she was his therapist, and the Joker just manipulated her into it. He told her all the stories that would make her sympathetic, and he had apparently, as Batman said in one of the animated series, he had pegged her for help the day he met her. So it's interesting to see what they're doing with the new show, because because it's one of those arguments. It's what we call a codependent relationship. She wants to be abused because he loves her. I mean, literally the lines in the show are literally, "I know he's rough with me, but I know in his heart he really loves me." And I mean, I've heard that from real women in the world who say that about unpleasant men that they're with. I was going to use a more colorful.
Real toxic men.
What a real toxic male looks like. And the Joker would definitely fall into that example. The embodiment of a toxic male relationship that is abusing the woman, who's allowing herself to be abused for her emotions. I don't know how they're going to run with that and keep any sort of feminist dogma in it, because Harley Quinn she's funny, but if you look at it closely, you don't want to look at the Joker and those characters closely, because the madness, insanity, and murder of it isn't funny. When I watched Picard, we were talking about it. Some of the reviews are good, and some of the reviews are bad. But when I was looking and reading reviews and listening to some reviews on Birds of Prey, I agree. No one liked it. No one said, "Ooh, this is great." Right. I guess it's just trying to cobble together a girl power show. And the weird part about it, in this one, if Harley Quinn beats up a bunch of guys, I don't have a problem with it, because she is technically a super powered being. Unless you're going to tell me Batman is a normal person. Okay, the Batman that 3 cops could take Batman in a fight. That isn't the case, because it doesn't happen. Well, Harley Quinn fights with Batman, so she's not a normal being. So it's one of those great examples where you have these low-grade paranormal beings like Harley Quinn, and they have Black Canary in it and some others. You could understand whether they would do some serious ass kicking, which means you get these things where you get the 120-pound woman kicking the butt of the 280-pound guy, and I don't have a big problem with it, because they're paranormals, they're metahumans.
Right.
But in the case, I have problems when, it's a horrible message to give a woman who doesn't have superpowers to say, yeah, you're 120 pounds, so, that big biker in the corner, just go up and slap his face, and you'll be able to throw him around the room.
Are you saying women can't do everything a man can do, you toxic male?
Hey, if I'm a toxic male, then you're a dog-faced lion pony soldier or whatever.
Touché.
Touché. Yeah, from one of our great citizen statesmen, Joe Biden, dog-faced pony soldier.
Yeah, he called a woman that.
He called it, yeah, and it isn't even a real. And someone said, "What's some of John Wayne movies?" I've seen a lot of John Wayne movies. That is not.
Well, even if it wasn't, if a conservative said that to a woman,
called her a dog-faced,
it would have been, oh my gosh, it would have made headlines on CNN, on MSNBC, the New York Times. It would have been just, everybody would have went crazy.
And they'd have been calling him for his head, whereas it became more of a funny piece now.
The conservative would have gotten fired.
Oh yeah, his campaign would have been over. Of course, Joe Biden's campaign probably is over, so it really doesn't matter. This is the problem with the superhero genre in general, is that you do have the advantages. They had this movie Alita Battle Angel, and she was a female character, but she's also superpowered, so you don't have a problem where they're doing superpowered things. I don't like the idea that you should lie to women and say that if you're a 120-pound woman, a 250-pound man is probably 3 times as strong as you are. Okay, that's just the way it is. And you say all of them. If you're 120 pound and 280, unless he's just really fat and you're really buff, it's probably the case. I mean, it's just the way it is. And if you don't tell women that you need to deal with men as they are, just like a small man dealing with a large man type of situation, you're asking to get yourself hurt and beaten and killed and abused.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
On that note.
On that cheery note.
All right. Picard. That's a series now. The Picard.
Yeah, it is a series, and I've been trying to keep up on it. The general consensus is that if you're I said this last time, if you're a Next Gen fan, you're going to love it, because you're going to forgive all the dullness of it, all the sanctimonious part of it that it has. You're going to go along and say, yes, it's wonderful. They actually got into space in the last episode. He runs into this first Raffi, who he had ruined her career when he protested against what Starfleet did about the Martian thing when not helping the Romulans.
Mm-hmm.
And this woman, Michelle Hurd, she always shows up in movies and she's always supposed to play a badass woman. I mean, that's her role that she plays. She's always supposed to be that. It was just not very interesting. I mean, again, my problem is you've got the Romulans involved in it, and you've got the Borg. The Borg always bored me to hell. There are a lot of interesting synthetic race ideas. I mean, Fred Saberhagen wrote a series of books called The Berserkers. Fascinating books about machines wanting to just wipe out organic life entirely. Mm-hmm. I mean, that is interesting, but it's not the case in this. It's just not very interesting. The weird part about, I think the difference in Star Trek is that, and I'll use a political analogy because we do that a lot here. When I look at Trek Classic, it reminds me of Trek Classic was trying to talk about the countercultural issues of the 1960s, but it also still had the idea that military was military, and that you have to prepare for the worst. Plan for the worst and expect the best, but plan for the worst. So the Starfleet ships have phasers. They have their diplomats, but they're exploration vessels. You may have to fight. Being strong is a good way to handle negotiations, and yet still all the idea of opening up and all that. It looks more like conservative thought. Conservative thought says, I want good things, but I'll plan for the worst just in case. Right. Next Generation is Star Trek, the Democratic Party. I mean, it's all wonderful. The ships still have weapons, but God, we never want to use them because Jean-Luc Picard never wants to use violence under any circumstances unless he absolutely has to, and then he goes around. I mean, it's none of the aspects. It's all touchy and feely, and this is just the recycled touchy-feely next-gen stuff now in 2020. It's just worst.
On that note, that'll do it for this episode. Do you want to let people know how to get a hold of us and yell at us?
Sure. Of course, you can go to... I post all of our audio on YouTube for every show, generally on Sunday after the show is broadcast. And you do a search for Johnny and the Professor. Put it in quotation marks. You'll find it immediately. If not, you're going to find some Johnny Depp movie first. Of course, if you want to email us, it's jpshowfm@gmail.com. And, of course, I write articles at Senior Sunset Times if you're interested in hearing from me.
We're not. No, I'm kidding.
Me neither, but that's okay.
This is Johnny and the Professor. Common sense in senseless times.
Victimhood has become almost a mental plague upon Black America in particular, because that word racism is being so overused that society is becoming desensitized to it, and we actually can't even recognize it when it actually exists. We think everything is racist. Things that used to be normal conflicts between human beings, getting cut off while you're driving, having a bad correspondence in a grocery store, you should just brush it off, shrug it off, and move on with your day. Now people are crying and making videos and pleading on Facebook to say, look what I experienced today.
Contact the show at jpshowfm@gmail.com.